Hello, thanks for watching this video. My name's Mike Morgan. I'm the Hamilton Fraser Legal Division Manager responsible for the PRS mediation scheme. I'm also one of the mediators. And what we'd like to do in this video is take you through some case studies, all based on real cases that we've dealt with and which show some really good wins for both landlords and tenants as a result of using mediation. Before we do that, I think it's worth just reminding ourselves where things stand currently in terms of dealing with possessions and evictions through the courts. As we know, the courts are dealing with possession claims currently. They're still doing that, but there is a significant backlog in the cases that they are having to deal with. And we know also that evictions are paused until at least the 31st of May 2021. We'll need to see what changes the government makes at that point in time. But even if those evictions are relaxed and allowed to go ahead, we still face the situation where landlords are having to work their way through long notice periods, long lead times to get through the court process. There are some limited circumstances where evictions by bailiff can still go ahead. I've summarised those on the screen, and essentially those relate to where there are more than 6 months rent arrears or things like antisocial behaviour. But the lesson from all of this is what we are seeing is landlords who are having to spend perhaps at least 6 months giving notice, possibly at least the same time again getting through the court process to get a hearing date. We're looking there at a year at least before the courts can decide what happens to a landlord's property. And this is where mediation really comes into its own. It's an alternative way of resolving that dispute and a much quicker way of finding a solution that works for both landlord and tenant. So our first case study was around or about a tenant who wanted to remain at the property although they were in rent arrears. And the story here was that this tenant had been a very good tenant for many years, a long-standing tenancy, never had any arrears previously, but had got into a difficult situation during lockdown with the loss of their job during furlough. The landlord was happy for the tenant to remain at the property, but wanted them to repay their arrears at a monthly rate, which was not affordable to the tenant. They couldn't manage that additional monthly lump sum on top of their normal rent to clear the arrears in the timescale that the landlord was expecting. The tenant was also concerned that their fixed term tenancy was due to end before the payment plan proposed by the landlord, and they were slightly anxious about having to continue to repay rent arrears and possibly also having to make alternative arrangements for where they were going to live in the future. What happened in this case was that we were able to explore with the tenant whether there were alternative means available to them to be able to clear the arrears. And what transpired was that the tenant was able to find a loan which gave them a lump sum of money which allowed them to clear the arrears in full. What it also meant was for the tenant that the monthly repayments and the period of months over which they'd repay that loan was much more affordable for the tenant. So in theory, both sides come away with a solution that works for them. What was proposed to the landlord was that if the tenant was able to repay the arrears in full in a single sum, would the landlord be willing to give them another fixed term which ended at the same time as the repayment of the bank loan? And in exchange for that lump sum payment to clear the arrears, the landlord was happy to do that. Tenant got security for at least the loan period. The backstory to this tenancy was that the tenant had a child with special needs, and they wanted to make sure that their child wasn't disrupted, wasn't taken away from school during a difficult time. And this was a really good solution for both parties. Landlord was happy, got their arrears. Tenant was working, continuing to pay the monthly rent, and a nice mutually acceptable solution for both parties. Our next case was a bit more difficult, and this was a tenant who lived in a high value property, a high rent property, got themselves into severe financial difficulty during lockdown, although there was perhaps a suspicion that the tenant was also using lockdown and reasons not to pay the rent because of that to their advantage. The history of the tenancy also showed that they'd had on and off rent arrears throughout the course of the tenancy, and not an insignificant sum of rent arrears. In this particular case, we were looking at tens of thousands of pounds of arrears. Very difficult negotiation between the tenant and the landlord. In the end, the landlord was happy to give the tenant two options. One was that the tenant vacate the property in August 2020. This was 3 months into the future. What the landlord also offered was to say that if the tenant was to leave on that date, the landlord would waive 3 months rent arrears, reflecting that period. But they said that in relation to the remaining arrears, and of course the current rent that normally fell due, that needed to be paid within the next 12 months. The alternative option that the landlord was able to offer was that the tenant would remain at the property. They wouldn't be offered any discount on their rent arrears, and the arrears that they did have had to be paid in full in 9 months. As I say, difficult negotiation with landlord and tenant. The tenant in this case was somebody who was saying, what's the landlord going to do? If I don't pay and the landlord wants to take me to court, they are facing many months of notice and many months to get to a court hearing. And in that time, any rent arrears that accrue obviously continue to grow. So there was perhaps a little bit of a element of the tenant maybe chancing their arm a bit, seeing how far they could push things with the landlord. But what was important for us to do in this mediation was to explain to the tenant that that actually doesn't help anybody. It certainly doesn't help the landlord, and it certainly doesn't help the tenant, because whilst they think they might be getting away with something, all they're actually doing is postponing the inevitable and building up an even bigger debt. So really what we're having to explain to tenants is that rent arrears don't go away. They're still going to be paid by a tenant, and what we're trying to do in mediation is to see whether there's a compromise or some middle ground that works for both parties, gets everybody back on an even keel, and allows them to move onwards, put their dispute behind them. In this particular case, the tenant agreed that they would remain at the property and they would clear all of their arrears within 9 months. In fact, it turned out that they did it within 6 months, and arrears were cleared in full. And in fact, this was a case that I dealt with, and I remember having a conversation with the tenant after the event, who thanked us for our help and for our I suppose intervention in some sense to try and negotiate with the landlord what some alternatives might be. And I remember them saying to me, you know, I realise that I am a difficult person. I like to have my cake and eat it. And in this particular case, really what I needed was somebody to say no. And that's what we were able to do in mediation. One step removed from the landlord, able to have a little bit more perhaps of a friendly discussion with the tenant, and some explanation that actually we just want to get this passed and put behind us for everybody's sake, and here are the options for doing it. So our next case study, slightly different situation. This was a tenant who was living in an HMO, housing multiple occupation. They were, I remember, a bit of a gothic. They liked their heavy metal music. And they weren't speaking to the landlord or other tenants in the property. They would come home from work, shut the door, and put their loud music on and be rather aloof and antisocial, awkward neighbour to their other tenants. In this case, the landlord said, well, you know, I've tried everything to get hold of this tenant. I've tried everything to speak to them. They won't speak to me. You know, I'm not sure that they'll even speak to you. Actually, we were able to get hold of the tenant. I think this often happens in mediation where people realise that we're not the landlord, we're not the person that maybe they're in a dispute with, or perhaps they're keeping their head down to avoid something. And often they'll open up to us once we're able to explain to them that we're there as much to help them as we are to help the landlord. Obviously, we've got to act in the best interest of everybody, but we're there to try and find a solution that works for them both. In this particular case, the tenant opened up a bit. They got some personal and work problems going on in their life, which they shared with us confidentially, of course. But eventually what happened was that the tenant agreed, actually, maybe living in a shared house is not the best arrangement for me. If I find that playing loud music helps me deal with difficult times or personal difficulties, that's fine, but I shouldn't impose that on other people. I really need to look for somewhere different to live, not in a shared arrangement. So the tenant agreed to leave voluntarily. There weren't any rent arrears. And the other thing I think that was useful here was that the landlord learnt a little bit more about how HMOs work and was able to change their sort of onboarding process for other tenants in the future, so that they could hopefully look at ways to prevent the same sort of thing happening with another tenant. And our next case study here then is a bit of a win-win situation, and a nice example of a mediator being able to break a stalemate. In fact, in this case, both parties were right, but what was happening was that the letting agent was approaching things in the wrong way and creating a bit of a stalemate or an impasse. The story was here that the tenant was complaining about a lack of repair at the property and some work that needed to be done. And they'd reached the situation where the tenant had got to the point where they had withheld some of their rent on account of the fact that the agent wasn't making sufficient arrangements to get the repairs completed. The agent, from their perspective, was saying to the tenant that we're very happy to arrange for the works to be completed, but we're not doing it until you pay your rent arrears. So parties at loggerheads, difficult stalemate. The landlord realised there was a problem and that he needed somebody other than the agent to negotiate, help intervene between himself and the tenant. And in this particular case, the result of us having some long conversations with both parties was that the landlord was very happy to arrange for the work to be done. The tenant was very happy to bring their arrears up to date. They just wanted the problem sorted. And it was possible to arrange and agree a date when the contractors would be able to attend the property to complete the repair work. And on that day, once the repair work had been completed, the tenant undertook to clear the outstanding rent arrears on the same day. A little bit more to it mechanically on the day. Of course, landlord was having to visit the property, liaise with the contractors, liaise with the tenant, but the problem was solved. The rent arrears were paid, the repairs at the property were completed. Not such a happy outcome, I suspect, for landlord and letting agent. I suspect there may have been a little bit of a parting of the ways after this, but a good example, I think, of actually battering heads with each other is not necessarily the best way to resolve problems. Talking and understanding, being a little bit more conciliatory, looking at ways where things can happen that are mutually useful, good for both parties, is a much better way forwards. So I think what all of those case studies show us is that there are lots of good reasons to consider using mediation if you're landlords, or if you are landlords faced with rent arrears or other problems at a tenancy property. One thing it is worth highlighting is that our mediation service at PRS you can use whether or not you've served notice. And that's quite a important point, because there are some schemes that say we won't mediate until you've served notice. There are some other schemes that say we won't mediate once you have served notice. We don't think either of those approaches are particularly helpful. So we will offer our mediation service at any stage that there's a problem. Having said that, some landlords find that serving notice and then offering mediation works quite well together. If you like, the notice to the tenant is a bit of a stick to say I'm serious about resolving this issue, and the offer of mediation is the carrot, if you like, whereby the landlord says, you know, this doesn't have to get legal, this doesn't have to end up with everybody fighting each other in court. Let's get some help from an independent third party neutral person who can understand both of our points of view and see what's possible. The other thing I think it's worth highlighting is that mediation is quick and easy. Remember, we talked at the beginning about how many months and months landlords might be facing to resolve matters if they're considering notice and court proceedings and so on. Mediation can be done within typically 10 to 15 working days. So it's quick, it's very immediate, and it gets to a nice solution in a short time scale. The other thing I think it's worth highlighting is that tenant and landlord only have to speak to us. When we mediate, what we do is talk to each party in turn, which means we avoid that situation where we have all the parties together in a room or a virtual room or on a phone call, and maybe they feel a little bit more inhibited or restrained or uncomfortable about discussing their point of view and what solution might work for them. So it's what I call shuttle diplomacy, or ping pong diplomacy if you like, a bit of backwards and forwards between the parties, understanding each party's position. And as I say, you only have to talk to us, which may be a lot easier for you than speaking to a tenant that you're already perhaps in difficulties with. You've got nothing to lose as a landlord. Remember, mediation is about reaching an agreement. It's about reaching an outcome that you and the tenant are both happy with. And if that's not possible, you've lost nothing. You can still pursue your normal legal entitlement in a normal way, serve notice if you haven't already done so, consider court proceedings and take which route you prefer to resolve the dispute more formally. So I always think that mediation is worth considering. It's got to be worth a go. You've got nothing to lose. It can also save you time and money. Think about those cases where landlords are having to spend many months getting through the court process. That all adds time, it all adds cost. It also means that rent arrears may continue to accumulate throughout that period. So in a way, I think you could start to think about mediation being a case of having to sort of speculate to accumulate. Is it worth spending some money now to get this situation resolved and avoiding an even bigger problem, a longer problem, a more expensive problem in the future? Remember, with mediation, we're not just talking about things like negotiating rent repayment plans. We're also talking about possibly agreeing with tenants that they may need to leave a property. And sometimes in the other cases that you've seen, it's also about relationships and trying to, make those work better, both to solve an immediate problem, but also to give a better understanding and get things back on an even track for the future. And the last thing I'd say about mediation is it's flexible. It can be done by phone, it can be done by email, it can be done when you are available. So it's very much about what's convenient, what's easy, what works best for you, and the same for the tenant. And I know it's a hackneyed phrase, but there is this expression, it's good to talk, and it is true in mediation. Once we can get that conversation going, within reason, anything is possible. And you'll have seen here that we've had a range of outcomes, quite different scenarios, quite different circumstances, but they're all examples of where we can get to a solution that is good for both parties within a short time scale and at very limited cost. So thank you for watching our video. I hope that's been helpful to you. I put up on the screen a little screenshot there of our website. There is an online inquiry form that you can use if you have any other questions or want to get in touch with us. It's also able to reach us by email and telephone, and the details are on the screen there. If you have a case and you're not sure whether mediation is right for you, you want to understand a little bit more about it, how it might relate to your situation, do give us a call. We can understand a bit more about your particular scenario, and we can explain to you how mediation should be able to help and how it should hopefully work for you. So thanks again. You know how to find us if you need us, and hopefully we'll speak again soon. Thanks very much. Bye.